I'm the city editor of the Denver Post, and so my job is sort of directing all of our day-to-day metro coverage. In this situation, I was in a little bit of a unique position in that I was on vacation when the shooting happened. My wife had reconstructive knee surgery a couple of days before, so I awakened that morning to, my phone just blowing up, and I called the office and said I would be in as soon as I could get there. My wife had a couple of doctor's appointments and couldn't drive at that point. So in between that time and the time I got in there, I also learned that one of the people missing and presumed dead was a family friend of mine. So my job essentially was to direct our coverage while also sort of being in my own personal haze and to try to figure out how to handle all that the right way.
Jim?
I'm Jim Anderson. I'm news editor for the AP in Denver for Colorado, Montana, Wyoming. My role, initially I was in Phoenix helping out on our Western Regional Filing Desk, and I got a call, and I spent the first 15 hours on the phone liaising between our staff in Colorado, dispatching those who could get to where they wanted as the news was breaking, and working with our regional filing desk, tentatively laying out staffing plans, calling in resources from Montana, Wyoming, what have you. And I was able to get a news editor into Denver before I myself would return, because I could not afford to take 2 hours away out of communication on a fast-breaking story. Since then, it has been to marshal resources, planning budgets, what have you, work with all formats, and with our far-flung investigative teams in New York or what have you, to pursue the story. And now that it's calmed down a bit, we still have a long way to go in terms of legal proceedings, what have you. So.
I'm the AP's news editor in Kansas City, and where I was just minding my own business, gawking at this story from afar and thinking to myself, boy, Jim is sure swimming in it. And then I got a call that said, Jim's been working 31 days in a row between the wildfires, and then he heads into this. So would you mind giving him a break for a couple of days and going out to Denver? And it was the best thing I've done all year. Loved it.
Thank you.
And all of your work. And my job was just to sort of keep the seat warm so Jim could come back and take it over.
I don't know if I'm like many of you. I woke up that morning to that news. My own reaction was I wanted to throw up. I mean, I was literally sick to my stomach, and I think it was because of what we had experienced at Virginia Tech years ago. It was 5 years ago. And you become part of a weird fraternity of having your newsroom experience something like that. And I feel very strongly working with DART in passing down your experiences so that you never know when you might wake up that morning and it's your newsroom that's thrown into the middle of something. There are things that we've learned that we can pass down and really carry that out and maybe make it easier for the next manager who has to deal with that. We'd heard earlier today from the great inspiring Pulitzer panel of how to do journalism. This is the flip side of this, is to how to take care of those people who do that. Because you heard from those folks, working 60 hours, just, Sarah Gainham saying she's obsessed. That the obsession works to the positive. We know we want those folks on our staff, but we know that cumulatively will add up, and people will end up burned out, and frankly they'll end up with not good journalism. So as these folks will tell you over and over again, people are our biggest resource. That's who we have to really keep them in mind, and put them as the focus, the forefront, not the how-to, but the people behind it. So, Jim, if we can start with you, with the conversation I had with Jim about this, leading up to this, he used this great word of, do you have a human plan? You may have a management plan of how to deal with a disaster. You have, this person gets called, you make sure you put this out on social media, you involve some other department. You have these classic disaster planning. But what do you mean by a human plan? What have you learned as a manager going through this?
And as a reporter prior, and we all bring our experiences into management, and various bureaus, various of our publications, we have plans for, what if a plane crashes? What if the tornado comes through? What have you? How do I deploy staff? What do I do? Who do I call upon from outside to help us? And as a manager, I'm revisiting that plan post-Aurora for my own purposes. It's not necessarily for distribution of staff. It's like right at the very top. Get in touch with HR. Tell them to remind you, because you're about to be consumed with facts, figures, phone calls, what have you. Tell them to call you the next day, if not that night, and say, start watching your people. And we're all very good at scheduling, what have you. Your racehorses, they do want to work 14, 16, 18-hour days, what have you. But at a point, you have to keep track of, exactly what assignment they've been doing. Are they working with victims? Are they working with survivors? Are they the best person to do it? Do they need to rotate out? Can you tell a racehorse who's speeding at 100%, sorry, you're off tomorrow. I need you next week. What have you. And finally, just to keep this brief, but I'm happy to elaborate, one for yourself. And it could be, this could be a tear-out sheet that you put into your bureau, your newsroom disaster plan or something. It's like you. Because you're not going to do your staff, your organization, your readership, your members, your subscribers any good if, and I still have trouble with this, hanging on to that, I can do it all for as long as it takes, I can handle it, blah, 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 until I'm not worth you know what. And I'm not doing anybody any favors, and I'm certainly not doing my organization, and most importantly, my people, any good when I get to that point. And it's still amazing how that can creep up on you, and you have no clue. So,
Kevin, tell everybody about the email you sent to your staff the day of the shooting.
Well, so I came in that Friday, and I got to the office, and I was, I sort of felt like I wasn't much good to anybody because I was consumed with just the horror of the fact that some good friends of mine had just had their son murdered, and even spent a little bit of time questioning if I should even be there. I didn't, the first day I didn't have a lot to do with copy. I did do some reading of stuff, but a lot of stuff was in motion when I got there. So I sort of thought the most useful way I could, the best way I could be useful in the newsroom was to try to do some planning. And so, one of the things that I did was I just sort of sat down and I thought, well, because I covered Columbine, and I covered Columbine beginning when the first gunshots were reported, and I covered it. I mean, in some ways I'm still covering it. And I just thought about what I had learned from that experience, all of it as a reporter, and so what I thought my reporters, what would be helpful to them. And so I sat down and I wrote out some stuff, and some of it was the kind of practical stuff that you have to remind people of, and like make sure you get a phone number for every single person you talk to. We're gonna need to follow up, and I talked to them about the fact that they were probably going to be, at least some of them were going to be hearing from other members of the media that wanted to talk to them, particularly in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. And I talked to them about sort of how to handle that. But I also included a pretty big section in there about sort of their own mental health, and about the fact that they needed to recognize that they were covering something that was horrific, and that that they were going to experience emotions and feelings during this, and that it was going to be unrelenting for a long time, that we were going to go through this initial flurry of a few weeks while we went through funerals and memorial services and obituaries and things like that, but that for us as the local newspaper, we were going to be immersed in it for months or years. And I reminded them about the help they have available through their benefits at work. I asked them to, talk to me if they were comfortable, or talk to another colleague if they were having particular issues. And I told them essentially that we were going to be, implementing a plan in which we were going to be ordering people to take days off, basically, that we were going to stagger that and make sure that, like, in that first week, everybody was getting some days off. And that's sort of what I did the first day.
Chris, what your advice? You said you'd kind of gather around people and prep them.
Well, last summer I had my own thing with the Joplin tornado, and sort of one of the things that I remember doing back then was I didn't have much staff the night it hit. The next day, full staff, full reporting team in Joplin, and I tried to get everybody around both by phone that could get a signal and in the newsroom, and I just said, look, for the next probably 2 weeks or longer, we're going to be dealing with this thing that is much bigger than ourselves. And you know, I told everybody it's going to demand a level of flexibility that maybe you've never flashed before. It's going to demand some, maybe even a sense of humor about all this, to the extent that's possible. The twist when I went out to Aurora was I was, you know, the new guy. And the news editor who had spent years establishing this esprit de corps in the newsroom was going to take a much needed break. And so I was this interloper. How does he do things? And I did kind of the same thing. I just said, look, just can I have 90 seconds of your time? You know, I'm not Jim. I am the news editor. Let's just, and I tried to be a little more affable about it, but you know, this is a big story and it's going to demand a lot of long hours. And so everyone's flexibility is going to be really important to seeing us all through this. And Jim makes, and Kevin make a lot of great points about forcing people to take breaks. And I force myself to take breaks, and it works. It works.
I had lunch yesterday with one of my young reporters that just wanted to talk about how she was doing, and we were just chatting away, and then she said, you know, the only time I've ever really gotten mad at you guys is when you made me take a day off about 4 days after the shooting. And I said, really, you were mad? And she said, yeah, I was mad. And I said, trust me, you needed it, you know. I mean, we had, you know, the shooting was reported a little after midnight. We had people that went to the scene then and worked, you know, through the day and into the night, and, you know, were in on Saturday and had worked, you know, 24 of the previous 30 hours, and we're beginning, and we're showing it, you know. But I actually took that as a compliment that she was angry about that.
So we're hearing it, you know, I guess the advice to pass on is communicating to your staff very early on that you're in an extraordinary environment. That acknowledge that, because they may be so, you know, just cranking it out and just saying, you know, we're in it all together. I hear you. I have an open door. Come in. My experience early on was to send out an email saying it's okay if we get beat. You know, I was fine with that. In this kind of situation that's so traumatic in your community, we ourselves are traumatized. You know, it's not you're not beat. It's not about a I'm trying to think of a business opening. You know, it's not a everyday kind of story. This is just profoundly different. And if you have, particularly as the local community paper there, and you're getting swarmed by national, international media, you can get beat. And that was such a relief to the newsroom to hear that, to say it's, to give them permission to do that. That was just my own instincts. And I remember sending that email out thinking, the people who hired me in 1986 would probably have fired me, you know? Because that was not the culture I grew up in then. It was, of course you're going to get beat. I mean, of course you're not going to get beat, and you will hang your head in shame if you do. But that it leads me today of we're in a different environment now. And Bruce, maybe you can talk about it, that it's okay to kind of open yourself up and acknowledge the trauma of the job.
Well, it's not only okay, it's important to do it. I mean, and I would just say, in addition to all the wonderful advice that has come over here, one piece of advice, and I mean this seriously, is if something like this happens, call Joe Height. Joe from the Oklahoman is in the back of the room, and an awful lot of what we are talking about now are lessons we all first started to learn and have built upon from the destruction of Oklahoma City and the way the Oklahoman carried that crisis. It was a model of newsroom management at a time when the culture you are describing prevailed. I would just add a few points that have emerged from conversations in newsrooms like yours around the world over the last few years. First of all, the kind of good management you're talking about, and it is good management, really matters. There's a very important study showing that for journalists covering serious trauma, bad newsroom management is as serious and severe a risk factor for PTSD or other psychological injury as the severity of a traumatic event itself. And this parallels what we know from cops and firefighters and the military. Leadership and resilient role models really matter. Management that's perceived as chaotic or arbitrary or uncaring replicates hostility in the newsroom, replicates the dangers of a trauma assignment within the newsroom, and kind of sends people into not a good place. So good management actually really matters. Peer support really matters. Your journalists who are most at risk will be those who become isolated from one another, who are not talking to one another or to managers. So you want a culture and a climate of trauma awareness in general, but of communication and peer support. Some news organizations have formalized this. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation has a pioneering peer trauma support program where they have volunteer trained peer supporters in virtually every bureau who are just there as resources when a crisis like this hits, like the Black Saturday bushfires a couple of years ago. The ethics of your coverage really matter, and I was very pleased to hear that coming out in these comments. There's some important evidence emerging from Norway now, where we covered the Utoya shootings a year and a half ago. The very young reporters who were the first responders to a terrible massacre that happened while senior colleagues were on summer vacation. Those who are showing the most psychological injury seem to be those who felt they made deep ethical compromises under undue pressure from their bosses. There's a nexus between bad ethics and psychological injury that really matters. And when I say psychological injury or PTSD, I'm not just talking about stuff you want to be sensitive to or care about. We're talking about real injuries that can debilitate good journalists, that can run good careers off the rails, and you all know about that. I was very intrigued to hear all of you talking about the kinds of planning and memos and things like that. I would just build on that a little bit by saying that we've learned at the Dart Center to think about planning for crises and trauma in a before, during, and after mode. Before, you covered somewhat, have a plan. During, all of you were thinking very shrewdly about. The after is really the important part. Now, it's important not to pathologize yourselves or pathologize your journalists. In fact, as a tribe, we're very resilient, right? Journalists do well. We have a mission, we have a job that's very protective. But if people start showing signs of change that last for a month or more, that just kind of keep going on, that's when you may want to say to somebody, maybe you should consider talking to a counselor or something like that. I mean, I think that's very important. I also would just add that along with talking to the kind of EAP resources that a company typically has, a local newspaper or the AP, you might want to keep in your file a couple of phone numbers for locally based clinicians who are real trauma experts. Not all EAPs deal with that especially well. If you need to find someone, we at the Dart Center can help you just figure out who the trauma specialists are in your area without really knowing anything more than that sometimes. But it's not something that the same people who deal with marital problems and gambling you want to have as your key resources. The key phrase here in the after phase is watchful waiting. Don't assume people are going to be in trouble, but be there for them if they are, and encourage a climate of peer support based on that same principle. Presume resilience, but also watchful waiting. And finally, back to the craft. Know that as the story goes on, the idea of rotating people in and out of the story is going to continue to be important. Everybody is going to need to make some meaning of this in a community-wide tragedy. Everybody has a stake in it. And when it comes to the trial, when it comes to police proceedings, when it comes to dealing with victims, people are going to become deeply invested and will still sometimes need to be encouraged to take breaks or absorb, or they're going to absorb toxic levels of distressing material. But this is, and then capture that and share it with us at the Dart Center or through APME, because this is really a collective process within journalism of a culture change around these events, I think. It's making our coverage better. It's not just making us nicer. You know?
It's interesting talking about a culture change. We talk about culture, of my generation, and then talking to Bruce, he reminds me that everybody's not my generation. I'm getting old. And that the younger reporters and journalists may have grown up in an environment where PTSD it's not this weird thing. They grew up in a post 9/11 environment. They're much more likely to reach out, right?
It's a much more open generation. That said, there is still a lot of fear. There is still a lot of stigma and a lot of fear that people will not get promoted, that they won't get the next assignment. So you need to create a climate before there is a crisis of trauma education and awareness within the newsroom so that it's normal conversation, not about pointing fingers to somebody because they come into work screwed up one day.
And we're talking about the extreme of a big event, but Kevin, maybe you tell the story of as a young cop reporter. I mean, you're kind of thrown to the wolves, and it sticks with you, though. I think it's...
Yeah, well, the first murder I covered was a doozy in which a woman was decapitated and had her hands cut off and was set on fire. And it was in Aurora County where in those days you got to walk right up and stand there with the cops and look at the body and ask questions and hear their crude jokes and stuff. And I remember leaving that, and it was out in the country and driving back to the office, and I didn't really know, what to think about what I had just seen. And I got back to the office and they asked me how many inches I needed and if I got a picture. And there just wasn't any discussion at all about whether I was upset by what I'd seen or what I thought about that, or was I okay? Did I need to take a walk and clear my head or anything? And it was just sort of assumed that it was just part of the job that you dealt with this stuff. And I was a reporter for 25 years before I became an editor, and so over that course of time, I sort of saw the attitude toward this change a lot, in a good way, I think, because I think it is important, really important to think about sort of the psychological toll that this job can take on people.
I think it makes people better reporters, too. I mean, because so people come to this issue of trauma and journalism through one of two doors. Sometimes they come in just from the craft. You want to be a good reporter. You want to know more about victims and survivors and how to do this work better. Sometimes people come in through the doorway of psychological injury. They've covered a terrible story, 9/11, Columbine, and Aurora, and feel distressed by it and want to understand it. I find that those who come in wanting to understand their own injuries soon extend that to a much more thoughtful and compassionate approach to folks who they cover. And similarly, those who come in really not being self-reflective or caring about themselves or their news organizations, wanting to get the story better, they start to say, well, if that's true about them, what about me? So it's a good conversation to have. It makes the journalism better.
Chris, talk a little bit about the idea of deputizing somebody as far as a practical skill when you're in this kind of environment, looking outside yourself.
Well, Bruce mentioned, think about planning when you're in the thick of it. And one thing that I always try to do in these disaster situations is, find, like for instance, when I got to Denver and dropping into the situation which I was only paying attention to on the margins, one of the first things I did when I got to the office is I just sort of looked around the room and I identified the one person who appeared to be the kind of person who could lead others in the newsroom. And I immediately went to that person and I said, I'm going to need you to do this, this, and this. I mean, I'm going to help and I'm going to be a part of that process, but doing that is going to allow me to think strategically about the next 2 or 3 days while I'm doing what Jim was doing. So, plotting the stories that are going to carry the arc of the story through down the road, which is one of the really important things that we try to do. I can't think about that coherently if I'm constantly getting stuck in the muck of the spot report. Mm-hmm. So, the sooner you set up a system in which you sort of have a right-hand person that you can go to and say, help me while I try to manage the macro of all this, I think the better off you're going to be. And get everybody, too, after the story, involved in the post-mortem.
Yep.
You cannot come to all these conclusions yourself. You need to get everybody involved so that you can all realize what you did well and what needs to happen differently next time, so you're all working off the same page.
Right.
And maybe if any of you guys can talk about, we're all talking about covering, you know, it's 5 years since Virginia Tech, our industry, huge things have happened, our newsrooms are smaller. So even the way we would have responded 5 years ago now today, the stress is that it's placed on you all thinking, you know, I could have had that many more people to do it, now I have this many. What is that, how's that colored your?
You may wish, you may have a wish list. And with working with the AP and our membership, we are blessed in the fact that people from Washington, National Security Beats, Eileen Sullivan, our news and information research gurus, who were like the spinal cord of our reporting, just incredible in terms of the University of Colorado froze its website immediately, citing a judge's gag order, and we're going to get to that in a little bit because it has a lot to do with the trauma bit. They were able to go back and find what was on there beforehand, and although we still couldn't dig as much as we wanted to, at least we had something to roll with back then. We had people, Washington, New York City, monitoring social media. We had interactives. We had investigative guns flown in from Arizona and Seattle and other points to get us through those critical, well, the critical first week. And I wish I could have kept them. But they have their own crises to work on at home. They're pressing needs, and that's a challenge. You may have somebody who can do the documents work. And speaking of documents, we had somebody in Washington making sure that we were keeping an archive of, you know, Freedom of Information Act requests. You can simply get overburdened with what you take for granted is going to be something that you can parcel out to staff when they're all out covering. And the thing with the guns, phenomenal. You have to watch out for them too. They're going to fly in. You don't know what they've been working on. They're your best. They're the best of the best, and they're going to work 24 hours because it's ingrained in them. And I've done it, you know, as a former correspondent. And you have to watch out for them after 72 hours. Believe it or not. And say, walk around the block, or you know, you might want to take 6 hours off, what have you. So, yes, there are challenges, and it's a matter of bringing people in from greater distances, greater resources. You're not going to have an army right in place that you can send out. But at the same time, in this new era, or not old era, you can have people working as intimately with you from afar as you can. But again, that is an AP. That's one of the beauties of working for AP and its membership, who also contributed a ton in our coverage of this. But there's another perspective to be had.
Well, I can just give you my own personal perspective. So when Columbine happened in 1999, I was staff writer at the Rocky Mountain News, and we had something like about 45 or maybe 47 Metro reporters. And, you know, so it was an all-hands-on-deck situation with that group of people. Plus, we pulled basically everybody out of features and sports that could write. We brought in reporters from other Scripps papers that came on sort of 1 week or 2 week, or I think in one case it's sort of a 3 week assignment where we just got them a hotel room and they came to Denver and worked. So we maybe had, I don't know, 65 or 70 people out in the field pretty consistently in those early weeks. And so I'm sitting here now at the Denver Post, and I've got, you know, 24 Metro reporters. We've got 6 people on our investigative team, and we stole some people from sports and features, but we probably on a great day had 35 people out in the field. So, you know, we're trying to cover essentially the same story with about half as many people, which is probably what you guys were in the first day or two before you brought in
easily
some outside people.
I think the other part of it is that not only is we have the 24-hour news cycle and all that, and not only do we have, you know, Twitter, which was up here a few minutes ago, and social media, but the portability of these means that even if you had the same number of people are much more isolated, right? You used to shoot pictures, come back. In 1999, you would still come back to the newsroom to process and
Develop
print.
film, yep.
If
Yeah.
you were a writer, you used to, most of us earlier in our careers still, when laptops were this big, still had to come back to file. And it's really a risk when people not only are racing 24 hours and are online all the time, but are not even kind of coming back for water cooler talk. So the kind of structured communication you did and the kind of ways of checking in and having the desk check in and all that are even more important than they ever were because of some of these changes.
I'm going to pause. Any questions? Okay.
You talked a lot about reporters. What about photographers? Do you think that the problem is any more acute for photographers, who are usually the first responders, the first ones on?
Well, there's some evidence on this. I mean, there's one of the very first studies that ever was done about journalists and trauma involved photojournalists and was co-sponsored by the NPPA. Several studies show that photographers appear at somewhat greater risk of PTSD in covering the same assignments. Now, we don't know why that is. Probably it's some combination of being up closer, of processing, whether it's digitally or however, but reviewing and editing images. So you're putting those images in your head all the time. And you're also not structuring them into narrative, so you may be gaining less control over the story. One of the great privileges for me in being a reporter was always to make sense of things. And that is psychologists tell me this is a protective device. Photographers don't have that often. So things like encouraging photographers to put together slideshows and otherwise, and multimedia presentations that do put some structure around their images may be helpful.
Can I add a point on that? Well, it's not really a point. It's just now that the question has come up, when we talk about this, we talk about reporters. It's almost always about the text reporters that are out in the field. And quite frankly, this is going to stick with me because it's not that I don't care about my photographers. It's just that for some reason I'm oriented toward how are the text reporters doing. And I think that's a pretty big disconnect.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, I mean, this the very impressive start to this thing with the slideshow. Those folks are taking the images in real time. And a lot of time the reporters are probably behind the photographers a lot of way in the actual journalism. So they're seeing this. They're seeing the crying, the grief, a lot of times the gore. There may be an ignored part of this equation.
I would say from my perspective, I always viewed reporters and photographers as being part of the same team. And so that memo I sent, I did share with the photo staff, even though it's really not my place from a supervisory standpoint to tell them, but more of sort of like an FYI thing. But, I've covered a lot of traumatic stuff with great photographers, and there were times when we sort of helped each other get through stuff. And, I'm thinking in particular, I worked with a guy at the Rocky named George Kohanek. Judy knows who George is. And George is for 30 years in Denver, the iconic picture from every horrific story was George's picture. The picture that ran on the front page of every paper in the country except the Denver Post from Columbine was George's picture. And, I remember one time we were out on a story where a police officer got killed in a motorcycle crash, and George was looking this way and shooting pictures of something that was going on, and I happened to notice that behind him some officers were grieving, and so he and I worked together a lot, and I just went up and I just whispered to him, when you get a chance, look behind me. And he made an unbelievable picture, and then afterwards we were talking about it, and he broke down and he was crying, and we were just sort of standing there holding each other in the middle of the street. And I think that goes on a lot at the places where I've worked. And I think, because I do think that it's I think the photographers are just as susceptible to these kinds of things as reporters are, maybe even more so for the reasons that you articulated.
I would also say that in our work at the Dart Center, I've actually found very often photographers to be some of the best, most credible leaders within the newsroom on these issues. If you're looking for effective peer supporters, photographers often really are actually more willing than you would think. As a print reporter, I tended early in my career to think of photographers as these unapproachably tough guys or women, and they are always, in fact, the cool heads. They are always the coolest heads in any scene. But because of that, when a photographer says quietly, you know, we need to talk about this, it's got unique authority in the newsroom, and it's worth thinking about who the photographer leaders are. Within the AP, Santiago Lyon has played a very important role in raising trauma awareness within the AP as director of photography, and it's a real place for leadership.
Yeah, I just want to ask, with the sensitivity you're talking about dealing with journalists, is there new advice or new sensitivity toward how you deal with victims or victims' families? Because I remember, for example, back in the 80s covering I think it was the Air Florida crash into the Potomac River, and I was sent in the middle of the night to cover that. And not only were my editors not responsive or sort of mindful of the emotional, you know, what I was going through and trying to cover something with all these, you know, dead bodies floating in the water, but also I remember the victims' families in a room kind of coming down the hallway, and I didn't know as a journalist, it's my duty to get the story and talk to them, but I didn't want to intrude on their lives. I'm just curious if there's advice or new rules or new thinking about that.
It's an excellent question. We're all where we are because at one point we've covered something, and I think I'm not going to make a blanket statement saying the new sensitivity. You know, yeah, we need victims, right? You need reaction. The pressure's there to do that. It's a personal choice that you made in the Potomac, that I have made in Venezuela and Haiti and other places. And sometimes, you know, I don't want this session to come off as, you know, I'm becoming Barney the editor. I want what I need and what our members need. But at the same time, by processing what I have learned over the years and the responses or lack thereof that I may have gotten from my superiors, I have a feeling there is a new sensitivity, and it may have to do with what kind of feedback we get from our audiences. You want to?
I would just chime in and say that, you know, I always told myself as a reporter that I would always treat people the way I wanted to be treated. So every time I walked up to knock on somebody's door, every time I went to approach somebody at the scene, I sort of imagined, what if it were me opening my door to a reporter because tragedy had visited my family or something? And so I tried, you know, I always observed that thing with just my own practice, and now I try to imbue in my people sort of that idea, and in particular the idea for us, that, you know, we're going to be here in a week and in a month and in a year and in 5 years and in 10 years, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that, I mean, we just need to recognize that doing good stories requires us to treat people in a way that is going to let them allow us into their lives over the long haul. And, you know, it sucks when somebody comes in and gets an interview from out of town and then splits and never has to face that family again, you know. And so sometimes we do get beat on those kinds of things, but I just feel strongly that in the long run, you know, that when you treat people that way, you're going to be better off and you're going to get better stories, you're going to serve your readers better.
Yeah, we have a lot on that on the Dart Center website, dartcenter.org. I would just say that it's not just about sensitivity, it's also about the much more widespread understanding that trauma continues to play out in people's lives for weeks, months, years, and that's part of the landscape of news. So, you know, whether we're covering veterans or your own communities or whatever, I think reporters now do understand that there is a kind of act two, that there's news in the later phases of terrible events, and we're better at finding that. And sometimes that's more sensitive, sometimes it's about more knowledge, but it changes reporting.
And aren't there better stories if, you know, you may walk up to that house that first day and you politely leave your business card, but you think about that and you come back to them, just acknowledging they're going to have that time to grieve. I mean, I've seen better stories come out of it a month, 6 months later. You remember them, and you've given them time to kind of just process it and hold that place.
I can't tell you the number of times I've heard from victims and witnesses and survivors who were approached by a scrum of reporters, mostly out of town, and the one local reporter, Carol, gives them the business card and says, just whenever you're ready. It's the person who politely gives the business card who gets the call 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 months or 3 months later and gets the great story. So there's a good journalism competitive basis for this.
I did a story about 3 or 4 years after Columbine about the fact that 3 of the couples who had a child murdered at Columbine had adopted a child after the fact, and nobody else got that story. I mean, nobody knew it, and in a couple of cases the adoptions had happened a year or 2 before. But I mean, I got it because I developed relationships with these people for over a long period of time, and I treated them the way I would expect to be treated if the shoe was on the other foot.
But I think that the point we're saying here is it's you're responding to the day of,
Oh,
but
yeah.
always thinking
You have to
far
think
out.
long term.
Long,
The
long, long
story,
term.
people are going to live with it for a long time.
Yeah. How about one more? Terry?
Thank you. When Gabby Giffords was shot in Tucson, I mean, we had people in our newsroom that obviously we knew the Congresswoman very well. We had people in the community. My photo editor had just walked out of that grocery store with his toddler son like 20 minutes beforehand, and he was, you know, all hands on deck, but he was in no shape to really work. He worked anyway. But we have to keep doing this. One of the things I remember when this was happening and my phone was exploding was I had heard Carole speak at a seminar, I think maybe a year or 2 before, talking about managing this. We had all these people obviously parachuted in to do the story and then, you know, went away. And we're still covering this story. You're still covering this story. My condolences to your friend who lost their child. When you heard that, how did you look at how your reporters are approaching people? Were there any moments there where maybe you cringed, or moments where you thought, wow, they really did that really well?
I was actually proud of how they dealt with that, and part of that was because my friend Tom Sullivan, at the earliest part of the day, they had all this confusion. Maybe he was at this hospital, maybe he was at that hospital. They couldn't get a hold of him. They were running around, and Tom has a journalism degree. He and I went to J school together. That's how I got to know them. And even though he's never been a working journalist, he recognized that the news media could get out the word about his son, and that somebody that knew what happened to him might be able to call them. And so he went to the reporters with a picture of Alex and with his phone number and sort of appealed to the public's help. So it was maybe not a traditional situation where you're knocking on a stranger's door. You know, to a certain extent, he sought them out. But I mean, I will tell you that sitting in the newsroom that night and realizing that the picture of my friends was going to be our play art. It was the second image up here tonight of Tom and his wife Terry and their daughter Megan, just as they're arriving at the school and starting to realize what's going on. You know, I sat there for a long time trying to decide what I thought about that, you know, and I finally just decided I didn't know what I thought about it because I was so, you know, just emotionally drained from my personal experience that I couldn't really think like a journalist. You know, and then over the coming days, I mean, I went to, you know, I got home that night and opened a beer and was sort of just sitting in my kitchen, and I was starting to write because that's what I do. You know, I was trying to just write something about what I was feeling, and my phone rang, and it was another friend that said Tom would like us to come over. So then I went from my house to their house until early the next morning and spent time with them. And so it was a very weird was a very weird thing. I've never experienced anything like it, frankly. I've written stories about people that I knew in some tangential way that were touched by something, but never anything like this.
Yeah, Kevin, can I jump in real quick? Were you still making editorial decisions at that point?
I was participating in that, but because I was on
and everyone knew about your personal connection.
Yeah, and because I was on vacation, you know, I wasn't in the first round of phone calls of people to get into the office. I don't know if people assumed I was out of town or what, but so I was there giving my 2 cents worth. But our news director Kevin Dale and our editor Greg Moore were really sort of making the decisions. I wasn't really directing coverage in those early couple of days.
Okay. I just know that when I have we all have stories where we know people who are involved, and even on non-controversial or non-traumatic stories, I find myself second-guessing my own editorial decisions in those cases. So you're operating there at a whole nother level.
Yeah.
Okay.
Strange.
Down front.
I just wanted to second the observation of someone who said there needs to be a page that says "you" on it. I guess it was Jim who said that. As a reporter, I covered 2 mine disasters, one with 38 dead and one with 26 dead. As a state reporter, assistant state editor, I directed coverage of a supper club fire with more than 100 dead. As a managing editor, I directed coverage of 19 shot and 12 dead in our own newsroom facilities, in our own place. And as an editor, I directed or was involved in coverage of a bus crash in which many children were burned up. Every step away from the hands-on experience, and I don't know what Bruce could make of this, was more difficult for me. It was easier being there when 38 bodies were uncovered on the floor of the gymnasium or 26 bodies were carried out of the mine than it was to be sitting at my desk with a whole bus full of children burned up.
Well, I think there's a couple of levels on that. I mean, first of all, any story involving children and kids raises distress. We identify with this. We have our own kids. We were kids. It's just terrible. Stories about kids are almost uniquely haunting. But the other important thing, I know when I started out in this business as a reporter, I assumed that the more really ugly stuff you saw, the better you get at it and the tougher you get at it. It's actually a little counterintuitive. It turns out, all the scientific literature says that increased exposure to trauma, while you may get technically better at doing it, also increases your own kind of trauma load. And we all have our own capacities driven by biography, by experience, by genes, by all kinds of other things. It's pretty common to hear, the more I've seen, the more overwhelmed I get, or to feel, or you get people who are fine, and then story after story after story, and then suddenly a story hits and everything falls apart. This is part of the landscape of managing these difficult stories in the newsroom, is to know that experience isn't universally protective, and in some ways experience brings more vulnerabilities. The studies show that the most at-risk journalists are those at the beginning of their careers and the end of their careers in terms of PTSD or psychological injury. In the one case, probably because there's lack of a framework and stuff, but in the other case because we carry so much toxic crap from everything we've covered.
One last quick question. Anybody?
I think maybe sometimes folks show their symptoms, show their difficulties within their families before they bring them to work. But there are limits on what we can do, even to talk to family members about this. And I wonder if there's a best practice anybody could share on that.
I just spend a lot of time talking to my people about how they're doing and try to draw out of them what's really going on as much as I can.
Yeah. One thing I do is, and Bruce touched upon this about management style. I could be rather demanding, but I've also had an open door. And in various positions in my career, that door has been used for a reporter who's just seen people burned or a plane crash or something, and just needs either to dump on me or to be in that office alone. And I just sit at their desk for alone. And I'm not saying it's great, I can't reach out to the families, but sometimes, or just they can know off the record, it's not going to be on their performance evaluation, whatever. Just give me the, the crap that you're feeling, or the anger, or, what you think maybe I could have done that differently. And maybe that can help alleviate something that they might otherwise bring home. Now, I'm not saying, everyone takes advantage of that. It depends on your staff, personalities, what have you. But management style has a heck of a lot to do with it, I think.
And not that you're keeping score, but I mean, there's an upside to that down the road. If they see you as someone they can trust with their feelings and the things that they're seeing and the emotions they're feeling, maybe come closer with that reporter, and that works out well.
I mean, I would just say this, and then Kevin and I both have a flight to catch, alas. Family support is important, but very difficult, and it's especially in kind of an American newsroom. The BBC sometimes will bring family members into newsrooms so they at least know who their managers are and stuff, but that's not something we tend to do here. I would say, though, that in terms of your role as managers, this gets back to your own self-care. Because if you're taking care of your relationship with your family on these matters, you're modeling self-care for your colleagues. And it's not just a matter of keeping your news judgment sound, making sure that you're not exhausted and all that. You're modeling for your other editors, you're modeling for your reporters, you're modeling for your photographers how to take care of yourself in crisis. And that can only benefit the newsroom in the long run.
I just want to close by saying, you have these folks' names, contacts, reach out to any of us. There's just a network of people who've been through this, and that's the whole idea of this, is to pass on those experiences. Please join me in thanking these guys. They've been really generous.